first of 4 firing line programs designed to look at the deficit and ways of taming it. We'll begin by asking whether the popular perception of the deficit will bring on serious political reaction perhaps as early as 1994. Our guests include the chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who may or may not wish to identify himself with the problem at hand. His biography reminds us that he has served with 4 more presidents than anyone else in American history. He is certainly entitled to say, with respect to the deficit, that he was present at the creation. Jack Kemp is probably the most prominent Republican in the United States who hasn't been president, or at least not yet. He is the principal figure in Empower America, a public policy and advocacy organization devoted to promoting economic growth, job creation, and entrepreneurship. Edward Regan was for 14 years New York State Comptroller and knows all about the making of deficits or their equivalent at the state level. He resigned early in 1993 from public office to serve as president of the Jerome Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. Peter Peterson is chairman of the Blackstone Group, a private investment banking firm. He is the author of the current bestseller, Tasting Up: How to Rescue the Economy from Crushing Debt and Restore the American Dream. He has been, among other things, Secretary of Commerce under President Nixon. And David Levy is vice chairman of the Levy Economics Institute and the director of his forecasting center. Mr. Levy is an author and a graduate of the School of Business at Columbia University. So, let's begin by asking Senator Moynihan, how heavy, assuming it weighs anything at all, is the public concern over the deficit?
You have 2 modes, and I think Ned and Jack will agree. There's a generalized, we must do something about the deficit, but a specific, don't do anything about my benefit. And that's the way our politics work out generally. I have some news, which I'm sorry to say is good, and make it spoil everybody's half hour here, which is that the CBO has just come up with new estimates in the aftermath of the legislation the President signed in August, that $500 billion fare. Though the spending cuts and the revenue increases, let's call them tax increases, all right? 4.3 cents on gasoline. Yeah, it's taxes. Plus the declining interest rates, which Pete Peterson will understand very well. On that huge debt we have, the interest rates have gone down very considerably. The fact is that as a percentage of GDP, the deficit is going to decline from 4.3% this year to 2.5%, David. And in 1998, then begins a gradual growth, 0.2%, 0.2%, 0.3% by the 2003, which is our 10-year out. We're at 3.6%. Now that's half what we thought we were going to be at. We thought we saw 6.8 coming at us, which is too much. On the other hand, it's a 3.6 that's going up. So you can look at it either way, but at the level of an imminent crisis, I think that legislation, which we passed by those walloping margins of 1 vote in the House of Representatives and the Vice President in the Senate, are showing an effect.
Well, Mr. Kemp, do you have any good news a year before 1998?
I think it's very interesting, Bill, that Senator Moynihan, Chairman Moynihan, has brought up the idea that most of the deficit projections, and many of those that have been used in popular books today, Pete's book, Harry Figge's book, Ross Perot's charts et al., have all been based upon static analyses of either revenue or budgets or both. Senator Moynihan has been quite not only candid as he usually is, but also perceptive in reminding us that all of the deficit projections are up in the air when you don't know what the economy is going to do, you don't know what interest rates are. And with all due respect to Senator Moynihan, the most significant good news is that we have a chairman of the Central Bank of the United States who's conducting monetary policy in such a way as to bring our bond and stock market into what I would consider to be a very bullish one, using that very advisedly. And secondly, Mr. Greenspan, Wayne Angell, Larry Lindsey, all of whom are Reagan appointees, are conducting monetary policy with an eye on making sure that the dollar maintains its value over a long period of time, which has helped bring interest rates to a 25-year low. When Ronald Reagan took office, people forget that the prime rate was 20 and 21. In fact, right through 1981 and 82, the prime rate was 21. So in effect, we were refinancing the debt of the 70s at very high levels of interest rates, which is part of the reason we had A, the deficit, B, the high debt and the debt service. And clearly, bottom line, limiting government expenditures, getting interest rates and keeping them low, conducting sound fiscal and monetary policy, and getting the economy growing again are the three ingredients to bring down both deficits and debt in the future. Now, if we can elect men and women who understand the dynamics of a free market economy, perhaps we can do even better by 1998.
Well, Ms. Beeson, what's the most vulnerable thing that you've heard from the Honorable Jack Kemp in the last few minutes?
I would say the focus of both of them, if I can be bipartisan, is we're talking about what's going to happen over the next few years. And I think it's time this country focused on what's been going on for the last 20 years. Our productivity has been stagnant. Real living standards are more or less stagnant. If you look at young workers under the age of 30, their real incomes have fallen. And during that period, we've gone from being the biggest savers and investors in the world to the biggest consumers and borrowers. So I think we have to focus on the long-term problem of how do we get more investment in this economy and where do we get the savings to get it. Now, the minute you go in the long term, and I think Pat would agree with this, when you look at the long-term spending patterns, Bill, and look at what happens when the baby boomers, this massive crop of baby boomers, retires rather early in the next century, what you discover is you ain't seen nothing yet on the spending side. Retirement bills are going to go way up. The health care amounts, I think, are going to be unsustainably high. The official forecasts of the taxes that our kids are going to have to pay are unbelievable. They're 38 to 50%. So I think this raises not only a serious long-term economic problem of whose consumption are we going to cut to get the savings and investment, but really a serious moral problem because we are passing horrendous debts and deficits and tax rates to our children without their even knowing it.
You remember that the final ornament of Keynesianism in the late 30s, when the brain trusters of FDR were worrying about how to look after him, all of a sudden they said, we owe it to ourselves.
Right.
And they thought, well, that's a really important epiphany. What does it matter what the deficit is if, in fact, it stays in American hands? This, however, is no less painful to the taxpayer who has to come up with it, is it?
If the taxpayer comes up.
Yeah, right. But apropos of the baby boom people, why doesn't Congress get down to indexing the age at which you qualify for Social Security?
Well, we do.
But not for a while.
We did that in 1983. Jack was around. I was on the Greenspan Commission.
Right.
We go from over a 10-year period to 66, then over another 10-year period to 67.
But I mean being serious about it, which would take you up to 70 right now.
That's not your problem. The majority of people retire at 62.
Well, there's an inducement to retire. They can tell
No,
the 70% benefits.
there's no real inducement.
Well, 70% of Social Security benefits. Remember,
Yeah,
when Social Security was established, we wanted people to pull out of the working force. But this isn't true now, is it?
I'm talking, just want to say that having been with this a long time, our behavior has changed. We retire earlier. David, explain that.
There may be some trends that are leveling out in that regard. I think that as longevity increases, there's no reason that people who are able and willing to work should be discouraged from working, so that they should spend 20 years playing tennis.
Here.
The problem, though, is not merely a deficit problem. It's one of standard of living. If we have 1 out of every 3 adults part of a retirement household by the time that I retired. We're going to have 2 workers having to provide for not 2/3 for themselves and 1/3 for retirees. Wherever the money comes, whether it's been saved, whether it's paid by Social Security, whether the government goes into debt to support Social Security, the goods and services have to be divided that way. So there is a long-term concern that is separate from the deficit concern in that regard.
But look, Dave, with all due respect, the demographic discussion that we're having is predicated upon birth rates, work rates, the economy all staying roughly the way it is today. The basic problem made in the 1970s by the Club of Rome and the Willy Brandt Commission, North-South Dialogue Commission, was that they predicted that women would not have any babies except in the third world, that the economy would stay stagnant in the United States and the northern part of the hemispheres of the world. Clearly, what saved Social Security and put it in the black in the 1980s was not just the Greenspan Commission, with all due respect to my friend Pat Moynihan. It was the fact that the economy recovered, inflation came down, the trust fund expanded as people went back to work. So all of these demographic static models deny the possibility that behavior, I'm continuing to argue on the side, I think, of Pat Moynihan, you can alter behavior by altering rewards. I don't want to sound like B.F. Skinner, but in effect, by altering the reward to invest, I think we can solve the problem Pete Peterson has. Pete Peterson basically in his book argues that we can encourage savings and investment by raising taxes today. And I'm suggesting tax rates are too high on savings and capital formation, and they should be lowered today. And I would accept the Moynihan proposal to cut the payroll tax to get more people to work so we can expand the trust fund.
Jack, let's be sure you
Right.
cover everything Pete Peterson says. And this would be a challenge that I would issue to you and all fiscal conservatives, quote, unquote. I would have thought what we could unite on is the essential requirement that we lower spending growth.
We can. We can agree
Wait
on
a
that.
minute. Now, the entitlement programs, when you have the kind of demographics he's talking about, are clearly going to go out of sight. It's arithmetical. Now,
That's the problem of the Club of Rome. They make arithmetical decisions based upon static analysis of behavior.
But Jack, whatever the problem is, can you argue that the spending isn't going to rise dramatically?
It will rise.
Fine.
It's more important, though, to expand the
All
size
right,
of the
but
pie from which spending
we'll talk about
comes.
that in a moment. But the spending is going to rise dramatically. The question I have of fiscal conservatives, and I've always thought I was one, because I start with spending cuts. My spending cuts are 1.8 times the tax increases. Now, the question is, how do the fiscal conservatives of this country intend to cut spending? And I find many of you remarkably silent on that subject. How can you avoid dealing with entitlement spending if you're serious about cutting spending?
Well, who says we need, Pete and others, to reduce the deficit to zero? If Pat's figures are accurate, and they certainly sound, CBO sounds pretty good to me, and you're going to have a deficit that has come down to 1/2 of our economy as we talked about, isn't that good enough? Doesn't every household have virtually a permanent mortgage? Doesn't every business borrow a little? What's the idea that all of a sudden we've got to go totally clean and do it all at once? Nobody else in the country does it. Everybody borrows a little. That increases their standard of living, increases their purchasing power. And I just don't see how you go down, Pete, to zero, and you've got the balanced budget amendment lurking around the corner, which would yank out, if it ever passed, $200 billion out of the economy and totally hobble the government from ever helping the economy. So I get nervous about the original, and responding to the original question that Bill posed. What's the mood of the public now? Well, if the politicians and the leaders, and I will put myself as a politician in this case, if we talk
that we've got to go totally clean, we've got to get to zero, then we're going to lead the public in that direction. And that's where the public is, thanks to Ross Perot, thanks to our own words in Congress, and our own stump speeches about balanced budgets. We're going to go to zero, and Pete recommends it in his book, the balanced budget amendment. There would be almost 2/3 of the members of the House and Senate for it. And if you do that, I believe you devastate the country, you devastate the economy. And I think we ought to focus on, as you originally said, where is the deficit? What's the level that it can be sustained and still increase standard of living and increase the economy?
And this really has to take place within the context of where the economy is. I mean, we have a notion that history began, at least economists have this notion, that history began in 1947 when the National Income and Product Account, GDP, and other statistics, quarterly data became available, and that's where all the models are run, and that's history. Right. And look how well we did after World War II for a quarter century, and then things seemed to get into trouble. Well, we must have done something wrong. We probably did do some things wrong, and I think we did. But a longer view of history says the capitalist economies, and I'm a firm capitalist, do not grow smoothly. You have booms that last for decades, you have periods of stagnation, you have depressions, and it's not always caused by some public sector bluster.
Kondratiev cycle?
Yeah,
Well, but no, you don't have to take the view that there's a cycle, but simply that these things do happen, whether it's randomly,
because of policy. Bad policy.
No, look.
Wait, let me make a quick point, and then you respond. Bad policy leads to bad results. We all agree. We may differ on what the policy should be. Most of us, it would suggest. But if you implement a bad policy, it's going to alter behavior in the economy and in the country and in the world. If we hadn't passed NAFTA, we'd have had a tax increase, in my view. Now, having said that, I believe with all my heart that bad policy leads to bad results, but conversely, good policy will lead to good results. And right now, if you want to get good results from this economy, we ought to hold down spending, to be sure, but we need to lower the cost of labor, capital, and this tremendous burden on the formation of the seed corn that's going to launch the next generation of technology, jobs, and growth for our economy. So it's single.
I think we need to invest.
Postscript.
That's what we got to do.
It's single entry bookkeeping to look at only the deficit and not look at the size of the denominator, i.e. the gross national.
I don't have an argument with what you said. But I'm not going to sweep aside the private sector problems that are independent of policy that easily.
Such as?
After World War II, we had a tremendous boom here in Europe. A lot of it had to do with rebuilding. A lot of it had to do, well, look, you had 15 years in this country when we had not invested because of the Depression and the war. We had an enormous buildup of liquidity because of forced savings in the world. That paled compared to the liquidity that was built. We had tremendous amount of, you know, by the way, there's some empirical research that the latest shows what most executives will tell you, which is that the cost of capital is not nearly as important a driver of investment as profitability, sales growth, strength of the economy.
Where do you get capital if it's not from after-tax profits?
You get, well, financing capital. Internally generated cash flows are important. But the main thing is that people see a growing economy. Are you going to argue that interest rates are what's holding the economy back the last few years?
No.
It's overcapacity. It's excessive debts. You know, it's not that simple. It's not all cost of capital. It's not all.
Yeah, I want to learn something out of this program, and the one economist we have here is David Levy, and I thought he said something important about that. You know, it is simply the fact that you know when we published our first unemployment rate, 1949. We don't know, we don't have any numbers about the economy before about 46, 47, as you were saying, and so our models were from there. But you say there are cycles. You said that bad policies lead to bad results, but I mentioned the man Kondratiev, who was a Russian.
Nobel Prize winner.
And no, he wasn't, unfortunately, because he said his work on cycles indicated that capitalism might revive itself, so Stalin had him shot. So good economics can lead to bad consequences if you were in certain regimes. But talk a little more about that,
well,
David. This is important.
We don't have to and there's some interesting ideas and some interesting research along those lines, but I think you don't have to accept the idea that there's this automatic 60-year cycle to note that, in fact, Hyman Minsky, who's a scholar at the Levy Institute, has observed that there's a tendency over time when you have tranquility, prosperity, people start to take it for granted. Mortgage lending standards ease, Safety margins and all kinds of financial transactions ease. You have regulations tend to ease. There's a move towards a riskier and riskier structure.
Hyman
until
Minsky.
something goes wrong.
Those are all policies.
They're all
They're all
but
driven
a
by
lot of them are
policy.
business policies.
They're all driven by policy.
Business policies.
All right. I'd like to come back to the question of why I think you ought to balance the budget by the year 2000, okay? Because you disagree with me. First of all, if you don't balance it by the year 2000, I think I can demonstrate to you that with the spending patterns that are going to be released in this country, it's going to get a lot worse in the next century. That's the first point. Secondly, if you did it, Ned, there's certain positive effects. I started in 95 and I do it over 6 years. I've had the DRI model what would happen if you had a balanced budget in the year 2000. They believe on Jack Kemp's capital cost issue, which I agree with, that long-term real interest rates would fall by a full 2% because they're now high. And one of the reasons they're high is the financial markets don't think we are going to get our act together. The second thing that would happen is confidence that we're finally getting our act together, I think would stimulate investment in this country. Now, over the longer term, which is my real argument, I think we got to get productivity from virtually nothing. And that my proposal is increase it 1%. I went to
It's already increasing. It's tremendously.
Well,
Sure it is.
if you look over a period of time, it isn't increasing very much. And I've tried to find out.
Recently, there's a change going on. I mean, I don't think...
No, but the question is, how much investment is required if you want to increase productivity by 1%? The answer I got from a lot of your colleagues was 6 to 8% of the GNP, which happens to be about $400 billion more investment. Now, I happen to be an investment nut. I think that's what this country needs. In education, in plant and equipment, where we're being way out invested, in research and development, in children, in certain kinds of public infrastructure. I think it's time the country asks the brute question. Where are you going to get the savings to fund this investment?
But you know too many successful top executives not to know that they're not sitting there complaining. The cost of capital is just holding back our investment. It's overcapacity, it's restructuring, it's intensive competition. That's not the problem. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with some of your long-term concerns. I think we do need to think about them. But to say that the reason we're not investing is because we're not saving, this is a general abuse of the saving investment, which
Absolutely.
is prolific. Economists do it all the time. Saving investment is not something saving causes investment. They are two sides of the same transaction. And the way we finance investment is not through saving, it requires liquidity, and that is the Federal Reserve.
Do you agree,
that is not
David,
just-
that one of the reasons people are not investing is there a sense of unease about where this country is heading, where this country is going to be in 5 or 10 years if we don't get our act together?
Bill, let me make a point. You started off this show by suggesting that what is the political consequence of the deficit or thereabouts. And I think the question that Pete just raised about what does the public think, I think there's tremendous disenchantment with government knows best ideas. Most of us would agree. Now, having said that, I think it's important to go back to the point that savings and investment is not just measured by those statistics that you read about in the Keynesian analyses. My wife and I have a very modest portfolio. I took all my money out of fixed savings rates and passbook savings account. I put it into the stock market, what little I had, and I feel like I'm investing. I may not be doing it directly, but that's also my savings. Pensions increased in the 1980s, or the quality of pensions in America. And as far as the balanced budget goes, look, Japan has a balanced budget. Isn't it ironic, as we sit here today, Lloyd Benton, for whom I have high regard...
They don't have a balanced budget. They're running big deficits.
They're not running a big deficit. Japan is not running a big deficit, but let me finish my point, David. They're being told by the Clinton administration to cut tax rates to stimulate their economy, and we're being told by not only the Clinton administration, but by Pete Peterson, that the way to get more investment is to raise taxes. I don't see how you can have it both ways. They've got a balanced budget. Herbert Hoover almost balanced the budget.
I agree with your point.
The way to balance the budget is through economic growth and limiting spending, getting more people to work. We're not doing enough to create jobs.
Japan does not have a balanced budget.
Yeah, they do.
First of all, Bill, you invited us all here because you thought we were all economists, Pat. I don't want to be kicked off the show just because you've identified David as the only one here. To wrap it up, Pete is right. People aren't investing, and the fundamentals are wrong in the country. You need more investment. If we're going to have the strong economy I just don't believe you've got to yank our borrowing to zero. No American does, and that's the way I think the government should
But
treat itself.
people
Thank you
are
very much,
investing.
gentlemen.
Oh, excuse me.
Thank you, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen.
Next week on Firing Line, host William F. Buckley Jr. examines the economic outlook for 1994 with Senator Pat Moynihan, Jack Kemp, Ned Regan, David Levy, and Pete Peterson in the second of a four-part series on the deficit dilemma. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, and the Friends of Firing Line. For information about